Good day, everyone. My name is Paul Adepoju, and I'm the ICFJ Community Manager for this Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. And I'm welcoming you to this webinar, and which is the latest in the series of topical issues that I've been discussing. Our conversations have always been around helping journalists to better cover COVID-19 and other health crises on one hand, and to also, on the other hand, we're also striving to ensure that there is a better understanding of various aspects of journalism and issues that are relevant to journalists. And our session today is not an exception, because we'll be looking at a key issue that we believe resonates well with the media industry. And this is the topic for today's dialogue is on decoding audiences and creating engagement strategies. In the past, when somebody says he or she is a journalist, what the task or responsibility of that person is just gathering the stories and reporting the stories. But over the years, with the advent of new medium, new channels, new tools for sharing information, there is a better need to have a better understanding of who the audience is, what the audience in this is interested in, the format that stories and content are expected to be structured. And this would actually ensure that the goal of journalism, which is to inform the people, is better achieved. And that's something we want to focus on today. And we have a specialist and an expert with us today, no other person than Riki Conrey, who studies audiences as the Director of Science for Harmony Labs. And today's dialogue, Riki will be helping us to help our journalists and media entrepreneurs to better understand what they can do to maximize engagement and deliver content that reaches those that really need the information. So I'd like to say good day, Riki, and good morning to you from Washington, D.C. How are you doing today?
Good morning. Thank you for having us. I am doing super.
So thank you very much. Before we go to your presentation, I'd like to ask you to give us a better understanding of what you do at Harmony Lab, so that our journalists can have a better understanding of who their teacher is today.
Harmony Labs is a 501c3 nonprofit in the United States. We use big data to help storytellers tell better stories. And we do that by combining data about audience, like who is spending their time where, online, on TV, and elsewhere, with information about the content that they consume. So we'll combine information about the URLs that are visited with the actual news stories that connect to those URLs, so that we can do three things. One is that we can know how audiences are situated within a culture, a full culture, including news, as well as everything else that they consume. Two is so that we can track major narratives. We've been doing a lot of work lately around economic mobility and watching how different narratives about how the economy works reach different audiences through the news, as well as their entertainment, TV news, music, and even social media. And then we sometimes work around story, which is a smaller unit. So narrative is big, and frequently we work with storytellers, mostly in the context of story, to find hypotheses that we can test about how to bring stories to audiences that help them envision a better future, whether that means promoting an understanding of how we can solve climate change, how we can depolarize as a nation, or solve any of our other major social issues. And I am the Director of Science. Sorry.
Oh yes, you are. And our audience are really excited to learn from you today. So without much ado, I'd like you to go to your presentation, and I'll be back with the question and answer section. Are you ready?
Yep. All right. Okay. So today we're going to talk about audience.
Yeah.
And audience is not narrative. We do a lot of narrative work, but today we're only going to talk about audience. And I'm not necessarily going to try to compel anyone here to an understanding of audience or how audience works that they won't already feel really intuitive. But the one thing I really am going to hope to change is your perspective on whether an audience is a blob of people who share demographics or geography. There's a temptation to think of your audience either as some set of people that's been assigned to you by a comms department based on cross tabulations off a survey, or even just the people who happen by your site and like to consume your content. But we like to think of audiences as, audiences, like whole audiences, people who share places they like to go, stuff they like to look at, and for whom a coincidence of demography and even geography is not necessary. And when you zoom out from audience as demographic or geographic blobs to the audience as a unit of people who go the same places and consume the same stuff, you get a different understanding of how audiences put stories together and encounter narratives in the world. I'm actually going to start here with an example where I'm going to walk through one whole audience. This is If You Say So in the United States, so you can see how this works. And then I'm going to zoom out to the set of audiences that we tend to use as a framework for understanding how narratives get to people. So If You Say So is a really fun audience. They are very gaming first. I've just spent a bunch of time in their content. They love comedy. They love video games. They love hip hop. They tend to be younger, but the imagery here leads you to think, oh, all these people are under 25. That's because we have a stereotype that is inaccurate about who spends their time gaming. This audience is very slightly more likely to be men, but they're like 40% women. And when we step back from forcing those demographic distinctions, we learn a lot about what is true about the world rather than the audiences that we want to impose on it. This audience also does have a big spike of people under 24, but there are many, many people in this audience up to about the age of 50. When we use an audience lens to think about which news outlets are important or what counts as impact, it does change the landscape substantially. The metric that you're looking at here is unique views of content on a specific day. We almost always use reach as our metric for a variety of reasons. When we look at raw reach for a specific story that's super important, the specific set of platforms that matters to different audiences changes. The story that we analyzed here was one day of the news following the murder of George Floyd in the United States. This is June 1st of last year. The most impactful platform by raw count of people touched was Fox News. But those people aren't necessarily the most important audience to reach. When we look at If You Say So, who are substantially less likely to consume news in general, but because they're young, because they're diverse, because they're urban, are particularly important to reach with information about this story, the situation changes substantially. They are most likely to have gotten their news about the situation following George Floyd's murder from Yahoo, not from Fox News or even any of the high level mainstream sites like CNN. And one of the reasons that we think that happens, they consistently go to Yahoo when they seek news, is that Yahoo reporting tends to reflect the world they already live in. Remember, this is the audience that's really engaged with hip hop. And the imagery of the stories they were looking at there on Yahoo featured Black Americans protesting in the daylight with expressions of power. And that's in contrast to some of the other reporting that wouldn't have reflected on their worldview that featured nighttime riots and fires. So showing up and reaching an audience is partly about making sure that the content, it doesn't have to pander to them. They don't need you to just tell stories they're interested in, but the content needs to reflect on the worldview they have and resonate with their experiences in the rest of the culture. Part of that is showing up literally where they are. We say meeting audiences where they are a lot. That sounds a little bit like we just have to agree with them or give them what they want. In this case, it's a lot simpler than that. If You Say So is by far the least likely to seek out and consume print news online. But they are among the top 2 audiences for contact with news on YouTube. And that's actually not because they watch a lot of news on YouTube, it's because they watch a lot of YouTube. The content that's really distinctive for this group of what they watch on YouTube reflects, again, this idea that you need to show up for an audience in a way and with voices that make sense to them. They watched a lot of content over the last 3 months that featured voices like Muriel Bowser, mayor of Washington, D.C., who wrote Black Lives Matter on one of our major thoroughfares, and Dave Chappelle, a Black comedian in the United States whose edgy look and feel is really consistent with how If You Say So wants to encounter the world. So this is If You Say So, right? All the other stuff I just showed you is super US specific, but there's a trick to how we organize audiences that makes the insights around organizing audiences cross borders. And it is that If You Say So is one of 4 audiences who has a value called autonomy, which exists in every culture in the United States. In the world. There is an If You Say So everywhere in the world. These 4 values, community, autonomy, social order, and authority, are cross-cultural. They've been measured for many years. They were developed by a social psychologist named Shalom Schwartz, and they've been measured for many years in the World Values Survey. The If You Say So audience that exists elsewhere actually surprisingly has a lot of the same cultural touch points as here in the United States. Hip hop tends to be big in lots of places. Elon Musk as a person is a really good touch point for this audience internationally. But even where the specific people and expressions change, that core value of autonomy, which is related to hedonism, enjoyment, entertainment, sex, having a good time, and substances, as well as creativity, self-direction, and I said entertainment already. That set of values is a blob that exists everywhere. So I want to walk you through what these 4 audiences look like in the United States, and they are going to look a little bit like audiences you're going to see elsewhere, because again, these are value-based audiences. Now, the way to think about a value is it's a goal. And they're not highfalutin goals like patriotism or purity. They're simple, basic human needs. People power's goal is community. A goal is the story need that you fulfill with the stories you select across the culture in your life. And for people power, this is the United States progressive base. The idea that collectives come together to solve social issues shows up again and again. They celebrate diversity, which is very different from some other audiences. They're very politically active, and they're very engaged in the service of racial and gender justice. If You Say So also votes progressive, but they don't believe fundamentally in the power of the collective. Instead, If You Say So is skeptical. They're skeptical of parties. They're skeptical of platforms. They want to think for themselves, and they like the edgier voices like Dave Chappelle. They are, however, really active for racial justice. Tough cookies are my favorite audience. They exist everywhere, and they exist everywhere in a really loud way right now. For tough cookies, the most important core value is social order, preserving the social order. A tough cookie likes there to be a set of rules that's very predictable that they can follow. They tend to be engaged with politics. They're highly engaged with the news. They're twice as likely to consume online news in a given day as the If You Say So audience. But one of the challenges associated with this audience is that social order orientation makes them authoritarian. And so they tend to be seeking a sense of what Karen Stenner, a social psychologist from Australia, would call oneness and sameness. They like police procedurals. They like cozy feelings when they're at home. And for them, the world outside their home is a dangerous place, and they are constantly seeking leadership. Interestingly, in the United States and elsewhere, authoritarians are not reliably conservative. They tend to seek leadership, strong feeling leadership from both sides. And in the United States, the tough cookies are 1/3 Democrat, 1/3 Republican, and 1/3 self-identified independent. They spend a lot of time consuming their news on all the different platforms available to them. So they consume Fox News, they consume fake news from QAnon and Epoch Times, and they consume mainstream news as well as left-leaning news from outlets like Washington Post. The challenge with the tough cookies, and I bet this is true internationally, although I haven't checked, is that they're constantly seeking information so that they can establish a sense of what the rules are they can follow. But in a situation like we're often facing in the United States right now, where there's polarization and disagreement, they go back and forth from these different places and end up in a kind of what my friends who do qualitative research call a despair spiral. because they can't sort out what the truth is. And one of the challenges we face with tough cookies is that they can often turn to places like YouTube, where analysts offer to explain it to them. And then it stops being news. So tough cookies have this great potential, but they are a particular audience of interest now. It's also the case that the tough cookies audience grows, and this is true everywhere because of the way our psychology works, when the conditions encourage fear and anger. So COVID has increased the number of tough cookies in the United States. At the beginning of last year, we did the original research around this. It was like 20%. And then by the end of the summer, like 50% of people were leaning tough cookie. The interesting thing about that transition is that when your fear starts to be activated, and I experienced this myself, you actually do start changing the stories you seek out in the culture. So when COVID hit and we were trying to juggle babies being home and having full-time jobs, I stopped being able to watch anything on TV except the Great British Bake Off. And I think that's a really good example of what it means to seek social order from your media. The final audience is Don't Tread on Me, and this is a really interesting audience. These folks are consuming almost exclusively very conservative news. So where we talk about the bubble, this is the audience that's in a bubble. They also consume a lot of really marginal news sites. LifeSite News comes up here, places that traffic in conspiracy. For Don't Tread on Me, the core value is authority. And distinguishing between a tough cookie and a Don't Tread on Me is really important. Don't Tread on Me has what we call a social dominance orientation, or a preference to accumulate power for themselves. So in addition to wanting there to be rules, they want the rules to be made by them. They want to be in charge. Whereas a tough cookie wants someone to be in charge. That's really important when we talk to them and about how they frame the world. Don't Tread on Me's tend to seek out stories outside the news that feature very strong men, often leading families. You think maybe that this is a group that consumes, or maybe if you have a lot of stereotypes about how it works here, you would think that this was a deep evangelical group. Evangelicals definitely occupy this group, but so does hard rock. This is a group that will watch a lot of Metallica videos on YouTube. And depending on how close the group members are to the If You Say So crowd, they're going to engage in a lot of first-person shooter games and otherwise engage with a culture that's very much about dominance. So again, this idea of organizing our audiences, not in terms of their demography, but in terms of the stories that they seek out, the way they see the world, and their core values, helps us understand how stories can land with them, where they're going to want to spend time, and what stories need to get to them and how we can bring them there. So that's all I'm going to say about that. And then Paul, maybe you and I can just chat.
Yeah, so thank you very much for setting to the table for the conversation. And talking from a journalist perspective, why do you think a journalist or a media entrepreneur has to be really, really worried about the issue of audience engagement? Since on one side, and it's expected to be an individual's responsibility to actively seek out the right information. So when did the responsibility, when does it switch to the journalist or the media organization?
That is such a good question. So I want to think about it for just a second. I think I'm not a journalist, so I think you're all doing your jobs great. I think it's a really hard job. But I think where we face as a society some real risks is that we have audiences that think they are fulfilling that individual responsibility to seek out the information. And the information is not there where they are. And they don't necessarily have good signals about what the best information, the true information, or the real information is. The biggest example of that is tough cookies, who are actively reading literally everything they can get their hands on. And all my colleagues who do research in that group are finding that they are more and more despairing. I think there's a narrative that there's news avoidance. That is not the case for tough cookies. But there is not a lot of satisfaction in the information received. And so being able to show up where they are, to show up with stories that resonate with the rest of their cultural experience, which doesn't mean pandering, it doesn't mean lying, and it doesn't mean only doing kiddie videos as we were discussing before the talk today. It means having that look and feel that's like, no, I get you. Like, I too have eaten cookie salad if you're from the Midwest. And here is how this story affects you in a way that you can trust. That feels really important. The other truth is that If You Say So is also not a bunch of numpties. They're not seeking out print news, but they are going to Twitter, where they must be getting news. They're seeking out ESPN, where they get some kinds of news. They're not ignoring social issues, but the way they live their life does not necessarily afford sitting down and reading long form print articles. So I think showing up in those places, assuming that the people will want to consume your content, is an easier play than standing back and waiting for them to show up in the form and format that you are presenting.
Yeah, I agree with you. Can we stop sharing your screen so that we can?
Absolutely. So you can see my face.
Okay, yeah, very good. And so before I ask the next question, I would like to inform everyone on this call that if you are joining us via the Zoom platform, you can use the Q&A function to submit your questions. I'm already seeing some questions already. So if you really have a burning issue that you want our experts to help you about, you have the chance to drop it in form of a question. And if you are joining us via the Facebook live stream, you can also use the comment section under this live stream to also put in your questions. And on the issue of the audience engagements, and I'm really happy that you mentioned something that I think is also a major concern to many journalists and media organizations, which is this issue of bubbles, in which only a particular set of information gets to a particular type of audience. For instance, individuals that are pro-left-wing in the US would always be seeing content from left-wing linked personalities and media organizations. And the same thing also happens on the other side. But journalism is expected to be fair, is expected to be balanced, is expected to provide news for everybody. So for a media organization or a journalist and a media entrepreneur that is really passionate and concerned about reaching everybody on all the sides of the aisle, so what do you think a reliable, smart, and efficient approach towards actively engaging all the audiences on all spectrums would be?
So I think, and I recommend this to all the storytellers that I have, is having an audience is a worthwhile strategy goal, because hoping that you will reach everyone, especially given the wide variety of cultural preferences we have above and beyond our political positions, is really hard. Like, you aren't going to be a successful YouTube strategy at the same time that you have a super successful long form print strategy. That's different expertise. And it's okay to just be like, I'm serving this audience. So it's fine to let out some audience, but it is possible to present news that is attractive to a wide variety of people. And I think when we think about the people who need the information, maybe especially to the If You Say So's and tough cookies, and then how do we depolarize? So some of this is not research we have done. There is new research from More in Common covered in The Atlantic last week that suggests that being local helps, because there are lots of different reasons why that would be true. But featuring a local news source can establish a shared in-group with your audience, which helps to mitigate the distrust that you get from both tough cookies and Don't Tread on Me. So being local and having a local strategy, and there are lots of ways that's being done by major national news outlets and funders, is a really good starting point, I think. Yeah. At least it's a really promising starting point. The other thing to think about is whether you can offer solutions journalism. I'm seeing in the chat a question from Steve. We actually don't know exactly how well solutions journalism works, but we know for sure that it's going to be easier for people to click like on both sides of the aisle. So having a universal strategy. The other thing worth saying about this is that in data science, when we build machine learning or artificial intelligence models, those models can be biased unintentionally. And so the emerging standard in data science is simply transparency. And I think being transparent about who you are and where your funding comes from and what your vibe is actually one way to acquire and maintain public trust. One of the few sources that is trusted by Republicans outside of Fox News is PBS, for instance. because their vibe, their intention, and their sources of funding are very transparent.
Oh, yes. Do you think the type of news that a media platform shares has more impact on audience engagement, or the strategy or the structure or the channels through which this content is being shared? So what are the major factors that you think drives audience engagement?
Effective content is a more effective than audience strategy. So if you have really good engaging content, that is actually going to always be better and more important than having a really strong audience strategy. Although there are types of news that are really particularly appealing to certain audiences. So if you really want to reach a specific segment of the United States, you need to offer at least some celebrity gossip. And you don't have to. I'm not recommending that everybody rush out and have a celebrity gossip play. But Vice, for instance, is a brand that already has a really strong brand in that and is able to build quite a strong parallel news brand. So I think that content definitely matters. Having really strong content matters more than audience, but you don't have to pander. You can just be who you are.
But there are many media outlets that are being who they are. And sometimes as a journalist, you expect that I've put a lot of effort into this content. And in this age of digital media, where there are metrics that are attached to every story, a story that was well written but does not resonate well with the audience may not get a number of clicks. And it may actually weigh down on the journalists and may actually be used as a key metric to access a particular journalist. So what do you think can actually be done to ensure that, even from the part of the journalist, to ensure that this story, the goal is for more people to be aware of it, especially the right people to be able to achieve the desired change? You can approach this question from the angle of what people are doing wrong in terms of content strategy, so that they can take a note and improve on them.
I'm going to weigh in as a measurement specialist. All of the measurement is wrong. There's nothing wrong with the reporting, although probably there's reporting that could connect with an audience, and there's probably reporting that could be a little bit more down home and use language that works better. But the real fundamental problem there, again, to this comment from Steve, is that you're measuring the thing that you don't want to incentivize, and then you're incentivizing the wrong thing. Here's how this works. In measurement, the thing that you measure has some driving force behind it. Here, we're measuring likes and clicks. The driving force behind likes and clicks is two things. One is either liking the content, which is hard to do with some of the news we need to consume. A lot of the news that I need to have in my house about whether COVID is rising or falling, I don't like any of that. So that's a terrible thing to measure. Now let's talk about what clicks do. A click is an instant response, something that a human does because they had a little flash go off back here. Psychologically, those flashes are caused more often by anger and fear than by positivity, joy, hope, or humor. That is because just fundamentally in your back brain, negativity is more accessible. So incentivizing likes and clicks incentivizes fluff stuff that doesn't say anything. And we were just talking about this before, that on Yelp, all the beer breweries have 5 stars. Of course they do, they serve beer. So it's not helpful to say, oh, you should only publish kiddie stories, because you can't do that. And it's not helpful to incentivize by clicks, because those will necessarily drive the work to be more polarizing, more focused on anger, more focused on fear. So find a better way to measure the thing. Is there a better way to measure the thing? Actually, yes. Is it really, really, really hard and expensive to do? Absolutely. So I think the measurement's wrong.
So what do you think will be a fairer approach for measurement?
The fastest and sort of most practical approach to improving the measures we have is to set better benchmarks. So if you were stuck with only ever having clicks forever, and I'm not comfortable asserting that that is the case, then we would want to set a custom benchmark for each article or piece based on other articles and pieces intended to convey similar information so that you were comparing against a fair benchmark. It's not fair to compare my article about COVID to somebody's article about this cute dog with funny teeth. Like that's a bad comparison. And so in science, we always are looking for what the control is. And that kind of work can be done. It is actually really statistically hard. And I've had a lot of conversations with journalists. And this is true, by the way, for all kinds of creators who are asked essentially to evaluate their own work with no background in statistics. The kind of statistics I'm talking about takes some very, very advanced graduate level training. So it can be done, but it's really hard.
Now, another question that I would like to ask is this. At what point do you think a media organization needs to rethink its audience engagement strategies? And a second part of the question that I also have for you is, we've agreed that focusing on likes and clicks are not really good metrics, but there is a reason why they continue to be what the standard currently exists. So what do you think are the obvious signs that we are not measuring the right thing? And are they having any impact on day-to-day lives of people that are consuming this content?
I'm not sure it's obvious, but the constant and increasing polarization and the signs that in the US, especially, the news is being driven toward unnecessary negativity, I think are good signs that we need a different strategy for incentivizing. I don't know that there's any individual brand that is in a tough place here. The difficulty that we face is that we often want our evaluation to be cheap. Unfortunately, here, we don't have a good enough measure of the thing that we want. I've heard somebody from the New York Times once said we should be optimizing for trust, which is a thing I really like. It's not entirely true because there are plenty of news brands out there that are selling conspiracies and are widely trusted, but it is close. We should be optimizing for an audience having received the information, actively seeking the information. The other thing to watch out for is if you don't know whether or not you are reaching distinct people, then you should have an understanding of whether that's happening. Some of that's doable. At Harmony, we carry a lot of data from a variety of places that are the demand side that tell us which audience members are looking at what. But most news outlets have available to them something from the supply side. Simply, I have presented this and this many observations have occurred, which gives you little information about whether that's reaching diverse people. Sometimes you know whether they're distinct people, but you don't know whether or not it's all just people who are already converted and already well-informed and are just really deep into that topic. And so if I were building an audience strategy, I would be building a measurement strategy for understanding who the audience is and how diverse that audience is. And I would be optimizing for new users over time so that you are growing your brand. Yes. The data problem is hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, there is also an issue that I think I would like you to focus on and give suggestions or tips on. Every journalist, every content producer desires the viral factor, that my content will reach as many people as possible in different geographical areas. And do you think that is a really good goal? And if it's, how do you think it can impact how journalism is practiced? And what do you think are the quickest ways to ensure that a very good content reaches as many journalists, reaches as many audiences as possible?
That's a really good question. So I will say that I think virality or going viral, having an exponential curve of distribution, is something that scientists still cannot predict from content. So despite that we know that kitties are going to be more popular than articles about how drinking probably kills you, we can't tell which kitties are going to be 100 times more effective than the other kitties. But having as a goal really wide distribution is a good idea, because it means that you have effectively understood what the audience who doesn't already know your information is like. The main challenge we face is that we write stories that resonate with us because we're right here in the chair. And those stories don't necessarily contain themes or ideas that resonate with some exterior audience. So I do a lot of work directly with artists, for instance, who are very different from journalists and have very different constraints. But one of the things that really helps them is actually putting an audience, like if you say so, in their head when they're creating and thinking, just trying to reach toward a specific audience, differentiating the uninformed audience into people who are informed about plenty of stuff, just not your stuff, can really, really help. And picking one such audience can really help to make the content start to seed in the spaces that make virality possible, but definitely make reach outside the base likely.
Oh yeah, that was really, really good. So are we saying that only videos or content or cards will always be more popular than many serious issues that the world deals with? And if this is so, what do you think the kinds of content that more people consume, what do you think that says about who we are? Or this is not, or does it have absolutely nothing to do with individuals' personality, with the audience's personality?
That's a good question. Core values do drive whether or not you actively seek out content that is more serious in nature, although that doesn't make you a better person. I think that sometimes, because that's a value for us, we just assume that's what makes you a good person. But sometimes it makes you a person who can't tell a joke. One of the ways to think about audience is that they're swimming in a giant sea of the culture. And for every single audience, news is a tiny fraction of what they consume, a tiny fraction. So the other stuff that they're consuming is they're listening to Spotify all day and they're watching some videos on YouTube, or they are reading a book. And so news is going to be a small proportion for every single person who is consuming news, with a couple of exceptions. You have people who have Fox News on in the background all day. So I think you can think about what you do in news as not needing to compete with the Kiddie videos. Like, it's not, that's not your benchmark. Your benchmark is, did I get the information to the people who needed the information in order to live their lives? Things are changing and they're new, and that is my job, to get that information out there. Entertainment is not necessarily the goal of the news. I think that the click-through as a metric is driving us to believe that entertainment is the goal. One thing you can do, though, to get more of that traffic and get that traffic to be persistent is make sure that you tell complete stories so that people, like, the solutions model has a psychological effect, which is that if you give people that little view of the future at the end, that will let them be on board with your news and your news style for longer, rather than activating them once and making them shut down because you made them really angry or afraid.
Okay, there is one other issue that I always think about when I'm looking at how do media organizations are able to attract as much audience to them, to their content as possible. And it's also the issue of survival of those media establishments. For instance, there are numerous news outlets online, and because of the dwindling fortune of a print press, there is an attention to look at the online platforms for monetization. And monetization, a major way of monetization is putting up paywalls. And for instance, there are several popular news outlets, some of which you've mentioned today in your presentation, that also have paywalls up. And how do you think media journalists, how do you think we can ensure that paywalls do not get in the way of maximized audience engagement?
That's not possible. So here's the thing: is I am not an expert on the economy of news. This is a major issue. It's become increasingly an issue. I do have friends who are working in this space, including Eli Pariser, who is running an organization right now. And he talks a lot about the idea that we would want to have a part of the internet that works like a library, and news should be in there. One of the challenges we face with paywalls is not only do they limit your audience to the people who already know they're interested in your stuff, there's like a technical solution to that, right? Give people a bunch of free articles, just like Slate does. But they also just means test access to the information. And we know it, and one of the challenges we have is that the audiences with less money actually also, if you say so, for instance, tends not to be interested in news. I think there are There are creative things that are being done all over the space to help solve this. Widely available podcasts, which are in a format that's different from that print news, but can lead you back to engage with the paywall. Like, I think that all the experiments that are out there are worth it, and everybody's struggling with how to fix this model. Ultimately, my guess is that we will need to offer some kind of public option. Like, there'll have to be a more robust public investment in an information ecosystem that creates an intellectually agile electorate, because otherwise we're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, so even though the print press is still struggling in most parts of the world, do you think there is any audience engagement strategy that journalists that are working in this sector can actually adopt or adapt to improve, to ensure followership, and they can better serve their news content consumers?
The stuff I see that's really exciting is the stuff that's starting to use more graphic content, graphic novel style content, memes. So memes do have some psychological downsides. They can make things seem simple that are not simple. And part of the role of a really good news brand is to help make complicated things understandable, but not trivial. But the idea of using some visual material to make content more accessible, I don't know as much about international work, but here in the United States, there are audiences that engage almost exclusively with imagery-based media. That's not just the YouTube phenomenon, where I have friends who lament that their kids would rather watch a video about how to do something than read the instructions. But it is just a phenomenon that's going to be a worldwide phenomenon. There are audiences that are simply going to want to see the stuff visually. And so bringing it to them visually is really a valuable way to start.
Oh, yes. So we have this question, I think a really good one from Stan Tomzak. Let me read Stan's question. A lot, if not the majority of the content the news outlets share on social media is not good news. How do you encourage people to like that content? Content like disasters, social problems, climate crisis, content that is intuitively unlikable. If people don't like that content, social media platforms, algorithms think is news that is not worth spreading. I think so. This is an interface between bad news, which social media algorithms think are not worth spreading. So, how do you think we can deal with this issue?
So, I think continuing to hold the major platforms accountable for their algorithms is important. I think there have been substantial changes in how the algorithms work over time, especially on places like YouTube. They've been pretty transparent that they have altered their algorithms to lead you less swiftly to the conspiracy theory stuff. So that's all good. I think that hoping for likes isn't great. One thing that is true, though, on Facebook in particular, is that the algorithm actually prefers anger and fear responses. I've spent a lot of time trying to get content that is good stories out to function on Facebook. And so sometimes you don't have this problem on Facebook. But what can you do on the supply side? What can you do if you are a journalist who's like wanting to put content out there that people will actually like take their medicine? Like you got to know there is a genocide in country X. And I think, again, I keep coming back to the potential of a solutions model. The thing that if you're not an interested audience, you have basically two options of getting that audience on board. One, you can connect it directly to the personal interests of that audience. In the United States right now, If You Say So is going to consume a lot of content that concerns racial justice. That's an issue that affects them as young people of color. And so actually one of the things I have seen is that the immigration content that they consume, for instance, tends to have themes associated with Black America. They are interested in Kamala Harris's background because she is half Black and half immigrant. They are interested in African diaspora experiences. So is there a way that you can actually make it feel relevant and personal? That's that idea of bridging between you and the audience is when we talk about all the time. And then the other one is to offer a full story. This is the power of journalism. Journalism is not tweets, lucky you. Like you can tell a whole story with a past and a present and a future. And that power is unparalleled in our society. And offering that vision of a future is something that can get people to actually click through and read the content. I feel like this is especially true on climate. I want somebody to help me run some studies on this. But right now, climate is just starting to do solutions-based messaging. And I feel like people are going to share that on like, you guys, we could do this wind farm thing. Let's try this wind farm thing. That's more shareable and more clickable than something that's like, yeah, still on fire.
Yeah, talking of stuff that are likable and clickable, I've always had this concern within me, and I think several weeks ago, we had representatives, somebody from the WHO and other outlets that are working towards taking on misinformation. And when we talk about misinformation in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, I know you are aware of what happened during the call for people to the chloroquine popularization. And so my question is this: why do you think fake news and misinformation, why do they seem to attract more audience than actual news? And is there any strategy that those that are propagating fake news are using that real journalists and those that are sharing factual information can actually tap in to ensure that they are able to reach more people and not struggle to get the right and accurate information out there?
I love this question, Paul, because I just finished an initial exploration of this issue. We did not coordinate this ahead of time. So I can't promise that any of this the quant here is perfect, but here are some really important observations. One, fake news is actually a lot less common than mainstream news consumption. In the United States, for instance, we're looking at, like on YouTube, something like a max of 10 out of 1,000 people who use YouTube on a day are going to consume something from one of the major peddlers of fake news. Like a lot of people watch Fox News, a lot. So comparatively, when we think about the scale of the problem, very right-wing mainstream news is actually potentially a bigger problem. One of the reasons that that feels like it's not true, I think, is actually a journalistic echo chamber. Fake news and Q and conspiracies is pretty sexy. So we want to talk about it, we want to cover it. Whereas we've kind of already talked about how there are biased mainstream news outlets, and there isn't a whole lot new to say about that. But the problem, while small, does have a very specific flavor. First of all, in that values map that I showed you, fake news has a specific home. It comes from Don't Tread on Me. The main consumers of QAnon, Epic Times, and PragerU, which are the three that I tend to follow because they're really big, are down there in the Don't Tread on Me space. But they're very close to the line next to tough cookies, and they attract a lot of tough cookies. That's because conspiracies first of all, they're really cool and they have a lot of cult-like story elements, but they make you feel like you're in control. And establishing a sense of control is a really important part of meeting the core story needs or values for those groups. Social order, a sense that there's a set of rules that you can follow to stay safe, and authority, or a sense that you can gain power or control over your situation. So it would be always true that fake news and conspiracy come out of there. And one of the reasons psychologically that they might be surging right now is just that we all feel out of control in the United States. Two reasons. One, of course, is COVID. It's getting better here, but for the last year, we've all been afraid literally every second of every day. And the other is the uncertainty around the American election that just drove a lot of people to get into this very difficult psychological space. So we know that's where it comes from, but that does not mean that other people are immune to it. There's plenty of crazy conspiracy stuff that happens on the extreme left, like stuff about fluoride, stuff about, especially the COVID vaccine stuff is very universal. But one of the things I have noticed about those conspiracy sites is actually the thing they do that we don't necessarily do with conventional news brands is they throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall. So a core conspiracy site, Life Site News, which has as its stated goal, anti-abortion news, we'll put that in quotes because it's not very newsy, but really has a lot of content all over the site that is intended to draw people in on other topics. So they have a lot of COVID conspiracy stuff. They have Catholic conspiracy stuff. The intention is to provide as many possible on-ramps as possible into the conspiracy ecosystem so that you bring people in and start teaching them this new set of rules, which is a little bit different from how conventional news works and is definitely different from how conventional advocacy works.
Yeah, thank you for taking on that question. And I think the conversation is on ending. And I would still like to tell our audience that if you still have one or two questions, I can still take one or two questions before we call it a day. And talking about this issue of audience engagement and the dilemma, because there is a lot of issues that are dotted around being able to actively engage the audience and being able to actually succeed at it. There are several news platforms that I do follow, and uh, what some of them that have been able to transition from just being successful print outlets is also the quality of their web platforms. For instance, I remember when the Washington Post and the New York Times did stories to depict the importance, the magnitude, the size of the pandemic, of the impact of the pandemic, in which they actually use the picture to denote each person that died during the pandemic. That actually resonated very well around the globe, not just across the US alone. Another issue that I also want to bring about is the visualization and the tools that these media outlets are able to actually roll out. And when you talk to a local news outlet, they tell you that these subs are very, very expensive, and they are not, large teams are always around putting to these content and these productions together. For what do you think is a cheap approach towards expanding in media outlets engagement strategies so that they can actually survive the test of time by still being able to attract and maintain that loyal users of good news?
Oh, cheap. That's hard. So the reason that those data visualizations that outlets like New York Times, they just published a great one yesterday. Those are crazily expensive to make. And they can't be less expensive to make because they are custom art, and art is expensive. This is a thing I only learned in my late middle age. But what you can try to do is maintain a YouTube presence. So we talk a lot about where people spend their time. Like if you want to engage an audience, it's good to show up where they are. And there's so many options now. You could be on TikTok, you can be here, you can be there. It turns out that reliably, your top two places to show up are Google and Facebook products. So that includes both Insta and Facebook. If you choose to narrow your aperture just to those and get good at one or both of those, that's your best option. That doesn't make it cheap because good video is expensive. The problem with artists is they're so expensive and they're so necessary. But you can at least say, for now, we don't need a TikTok strategy. We don't need a strategy for every one of these. We just need to get really good at being on the major platforms and making sure we have organic reach through networking with other partners and maintaining our reach through a shared body of audience. So you have your own audience, perhaps you have other partners who reliably will link to your content on that YouTube platform. But the ones that you can reliably say, I only need to be here, are Facebook and YouTube, but also if you're doing paid promotion, Google search is a place that people spend an awful lot of their time as well.
I also have a question for you on maximizing audience engagement in parts of the world where there is limited or restricted access to free information. In suppressed democracies where the government controls everything that the people, almost everything that the people can actually access. So for media organizations there, their reach is highly limited because they are also restricted. Do you have any suggestions and recommendations for them?
I have almost no knowledge of this. All I have is rumors from my friends who do more international work than I do. Their strategies are very WhatsApp based. But it's super, super challenging, and the landscape there is completely different than even places that have somewhat restricted but available platform access.
Now, from the data that you've access with, from the data points that you are tracking, do you have any idea of how the pandemic has influenced audience engagement? Has it been a good, impact, or it's really, really a negative impact?
That's a really good question. So I know that it rose like a lot. People were sitting around in their houses during March and April of last year and just consuming a lot of stuff. I don't know that we can say what the net positive or negative impact is. I think we're going to see this year, as things settle out, which of those habits that people established are going to sustain. So a lot of what happened last year was really negative. People got into these terrible spirals of going back and forth with conspiracies. But at the same time, many of them started to consume more news, started to really tune in. So I think what we want to do is wait a year and see where we are after a natural psychological recovery takes place and we all are able to calm down. And that's here in the United States. I am fully aware that that year-long recovery is starting here now in a way it's not elsewhere.
Of course. Now, as wrap up, I would like you to look at what the future of audience engagement would be. Are there some Pandora boxes that we are yet to open? And how do you ensure that these are also very fair and everybody is able to actually maximize the traits towards achieving best audience engagement?
I don't have a good answer for that. It's very hard to tell where things are going and how to future-proof. One of the things I think is really valuable, though, is that those core audience values are never going to change. Those are always going to be built into the back of your brain. You're always going to have those four audiences. And the dominance of the current ways of consuming things is actually going to change more slowly than we think it is. And so it's not necessary to go herring off after every new platform. I know that it can become really overwhelming, and it's really important that we do more, that we evolve, that we meet people where they are, but you want to be strategic. I think the best way to plan for the future of any organization is to have a really, really clear audience strategy. Like, know exactly who you want to be targeting and try to move them where they are and pay some attention to where they are and make sure some of the other doors are just closed. It's very hard right now because you feel like you need to be everywhere, moving everyone, but maybe it's okay to just make your mission like, we're tough cookies. We're here to make tough cookies, better informed and more confident in the news, or whatever it is. Everybody has a different approach. But I think only a handful of outlets in the United States have the power to reach and move everyone.
So what do you think will be the next focus for Harmony Labs, especially focusing on this issue that we are discussing today?
So I have a few different things that I am interested in pursuing, and we've talked to partners about. It feels like the power of solutions journalism is, the potential there is tremendous. And so I'm quite interested in learning more about not only whether it works, but exactly how it works and how we can do solutions journalism and find examples of existing solutions journalism that have coding or language that feels different than what we've seen in examples of solutions journalism today. What kind of solutions journalism shows up in evangelical and Christian outlets, for instance, which is going to have a different look and feel, but how could we create a generalizable understanding of who's receiving solutions journalism and how that's moving them? That's one big thing. And the other thing that's come up just in the last week is the power and potential of local news. Partly this is because there's a little bit of renewed interest in creating and maintaining a robust local news structure. And I'm really interested in helping organizations that want to find ways to make local news efficiently, especially because, as you said, data and visualization are very, very expensive. And so maximizing those resources is something that we can help with.
Yeah, we have some last minute questions that are popping up. I think we should take them. Edna from Philippines would like to know whether there are tools that are available to identify who these value-based audiences are, especially for those that want to develop that strategy.
That is a really good question. The available data depend on the country that you live in, but I can give you an, one second, I'm gonna pop this link in there. This is a publicly available website with profiles and an audience classifier. If you do survey work, you can use a similar audience classifier to put people into the different buckets. In order to understand how these different values groups fall out in your country, a data scientist can analyze the World Values Survey for you. There are Philippines data for you there. And you can also start to use these values in your audience research, the ongoing survey work you do in your shop. In the United States here, what we're doing is we're taking survey-based value segmentation and we are crosswalking it to the data we carry on demography and geography using predictive models. Whether or not similar data are available in other countries just depends a lot on the country. And that is one of the real challenges of doing, especially audience-focused research. But even the stuff that you guys are already doing that is cutting like people into boxes, if the next time you run that audience survey of please click here and do a survey real quick, you're collecting the demography of interest in your region, as well as a handful of questions that help you classify people by values. At least you'll be able to know, oh, our, if you say so, type people tend to be younger, which is true in every country in the United States, and our tough cookies people tend to be women or men or whatever, so that you can get a sense of where these different values are landing.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Riki. Do you have any closing remarks for our journalists?
I want to make sure, I just talked for a long time and told you all how to do your jobs. I, again, want to say, I don't know how to be a great journalist. I think this is one of the hardest jobs in the world. I am a pretty good data scientist, but honestly, these problems are really hard problems, and I admire what you guys do every day.
Yes, thank you very much, Riki. And thanks so much for joining us today, everyone. And I hope this webinar has helped you to better understand the topic of decoding audiences and creating engagement strategies. And I hope this webinar would also inspire you to better maximize the reach of your stories and make use of different tools, different channels, and different strategies, and also start thinking about issues that Riki mentioned that you've not been thinking about before in your audience engagement. And if you're not a member of the ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum yet, I would encourage you to please find the group on Facebook. And for more information about the forum, please go to www.icfj.org. If you would like to access journalism resources on COVID-19, please check out the International Journalist Network at www.ignet.org. And please don't forget to fill out a survey that is coming to your inbox after this webinar, because ICFJ would love your feedback in order for us to improve programming for this series. I'm really glad about how Riki has been able to expand our knowledge, especially on these issues that we've discussed today. And we hope we'll be hearing from her and the other team members at Harmony Labs in the nearest future about the great work that they are doing. We'll also be joining, having a similarly engaging event webinar next week. So please endeavor to also register and be part of it. From everybody at the ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum, I'm saying have a lovely day. And we are out in 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're out. Have a lovely day. Bye.